So you got a lodestar of Big Star right there. Is that a good way to put it?
Yep.
So, Josh, before I go into a little bit of a bio of Big Star, because both the bands this week actually have really interesting bios, and what I'm going to do with the bios this week is, instead of scripting them, because we're kind of doing this on the fly, I'm going to kind of utilize the All Music biography, and I'm going to walk through the bio together, right? And we'll comment on it as we're going through a little bit.
Sure.
But Josh, how familiar were you with Big Star?
So I have basically known about them, hearing them like referenced as an influential band. Now, I didn't realize how influential they were until I looked, did a couple quick Google searches before the show today. But yeah, that's about it. I think I had heard a few of their songs before, maybe on a mixtape or something of that effect, but I've never taken the deep dive like I did tonight. How about you?
I was somewhat familiar with Big Star through covers that other bands did. And of course, I'm a huge Replacements fan, and they did the song Alex Chilton, which is about Alex Chilton. And and I'm a huge REM fan, and Mike Mills is like one of the biggest Big Star fans going. So what's just like you, Josh, I knew them by reputation, and I'm a little bit ashamed to say that for some reason I never really dug into their history, despite knowing they're influential, how influential they were, which is very unlike me. And so I was very excited that we were going to go back, because win, lose, or draw, I did feel that part of the reason we did this podcast was to close some of these gaps. I mentioned this the other day about The Wire, who I haven't listened Wire, who I haven't listened to, God, except for the one time I listened to it before, and how much it was nice to revisit that with the context of time and also being able to appreciate it. And I would put the fact that we're going to visit Big Star in that context as well.
Yes. Yeah, there is definitely some similarities to Wire in terms of how many other bands I thought sounded like Big Star when listening to them.
Exactly. Well, let's give you a little bit of an overview. And like I said, in advance, we normally, with the bios, we delve all over the place to different sources to get the bios. And because we're kind of doing this on the fly and we did our research for the episode, right, I'm just going to utilize All Music, because I think they do a really wonderful job on bios. So I'm gonna give credit as we go here, and I'm not gonna read you the bio. We're gonna skim it and do different stuff. But this bio is written by Jason and Kenny, I believe is the pronunciation of the name. So there we go. And it pretty much mentions that Big Star was formed. They're an American band in 1971 in Memphis. Is actually where Big Star came from. And what I found out in some of my reading was that Alex Chilton had actually been an established musician early in his life. He was a young man when he was in Big Star, when this first album was released in 1972, but he'd actually been the vocalist for a group known as the Box Tops.
Okay.
And when he was 16 years old, they'd hit the pop charts with a song called The Letter, which I didn't immediately think I recognized until I played it on Spotify. I was like, oh, okay, I know that. I don't know if I knew it was called The Letter or The Box Tops, but it was an instantly recognizable song for me.
Okay.
And so he kind of had a pre-existing music career. And he was one of the primary songwriters of Big Star. He also was involved in all three of the Big Star albums that we'll talk about at various times.
Yep.
The other member of the group who's sort of known, who's only in it for the first album, is a gentleman by the name of Chris Bell, who actually, after he left Big Star, ended up having a solo career for a while, and actually died very young at 27, tragically, in a car accident toward the end of the 70s. And it's very interesting because the two albums we're going to do tonight, one has Bell on it and one does not have Bell on it. And you can kind of tell a little bit what the difference is when you listen to both of them. But the origin story here pretty much is that Chilton had gone to Memphis in hopes, after going to New York City and trying to have a solo career, and it just didn't pan out after the Box Tops, right? So he goes back to Memphis. He knew Bell from a high school cover band that he'd been a part of. And so he joins this pre-existing band. that Bell's a member of. And they rechristened themselves Big Star, actually named for a local supermarket chain. And if you look at the cover of number one record, it's got the star logo and big on it, but it doesn't have the word star on it, because if it did, it would have been pretty much a direct appropriation of their logo. And so that's kind of where the name comes from. It's a local supermarket chain.
And you did you mention they're from Memphis, right? Is that
yeah, I mentioned a little earlier.
Okay.
They're from Memphis, yes. Yeah. And formed in 1971, and number one record was sort of they mentioned in multiple instances they were trying to speak things into truth, right? They called it number one record because they wanted it to be the number one record. Now, Josh, before I move into some stuff, I know you also did a little bit of research here. Is there any additional context you'd like to add?
Well, I did pull up, in honor of Matt, I did pull up the best ever albums rankings just so we have those on under our belts.
Go for it.
Number one record is ranked number 95 right now in the 70s, and Radio City is ranked 167. Those two big numbers.
So that's why this gets a bio, because it would normally be number 95 and it would qualify for a bio in most cases. But to go back to the bio a little bit, Big Star, the members of the group were highly influenced by a couple of 1960s music phenomenons that they carried into the 70s. And you'll often hear Big Star kind of, there's two or three talking points that you hear a lot about Big Star when you analyze them. One is that they might be the most influential early indie band outside the Velvet Underground. That's one thing you hear quite a bit. The second is that they are the bridge between sort of 60s British invasion music and 60s pop music, and then what became of the landscape in the 80s and especially the 90s, right? And then oftentimes you'll hear them as the precursor to modern indie. So all of those things are things that you hear quite a bit, and probably all of them definitely resonate. Josh, when you most think of Big Star, if you're a music critic, and certainly when I listen to this, there's three bands in particular, and it's funny because we're going to talk about the Jam, and there's a whole different band that I would think of that we talk about. But what are the three bands that you hear when you listen to Big Star? In both of these albums, I think. But I will definitely go out on a record and say, even before I read this bio, it was very clear.
Okay, so the big one right off the top is the Byrds. I feel like that is very clear in terms of, especially on number one record, I feel like. And let's see, what else did I write down? Well, I mean, something like the Beatles probably would come to mind.
That was my number two.
Yep. And then, I mean, they've got some Rolling Stones vibes too, if I had to guess. But what's the third one? The
third one for me was The Who. There were a couple songs that sounded a lot like the Who Sell Out Who, and we didn't cover a quick one. We did My Generation, right? But we didn't cover a quick one and a lot of the singles and stuff. And that kind of is the era of the Who that they sound the most like. But as I'm listening, it's like, the Byrds immediately jump out, which is interesting because I know Matt and I are big Byrds lovers, and I know you did not like the Byrds historically. So I don't want to steal your thunder later, your review later, but one of the things I definitely am going to want to ask is, how do you, comparing and contrasting that depending on how you feel about it, because they are so clearly influenced by the Byrds.
Yes, well, I like these albums much more than when I talked about the Byrds. So
interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, at the Beatles, it's kind of that song structure. I noticed for sure, and in the Who, it was the guitar work.
Yes,
that is there was a lot of like Townsend type guitar work in this, mixed with jangle. Of like Roger McGuinn and
no surprise, that's probably why this worked for me much more. Is the hard guitars mixed with the jangle.
Yep, gotcha. Okay, well, finishing up what's going on, 1972, they produced number one record. 1974 is when Radio City comes out. The most mentioned thing, and I would agree with this, is that number one record is a much more polished Studio Slick album, where Radio City is more guitar-based and a little bit more unwieldy, I think would be the describe. The description there. Yeah. Did you catch that, Josh? Because that was definitely something I noticed, along with there were lots of hooks in number one record, and there were not as many hooks. In fact, oftentimes no hooks in some songs, lyrically, not guitar-wise, in Radio City. What would you say you noticed right off the bat between the two of them?
So I feel like number one record was almost like more Birds influenced. It kind of had a softer sound to it, and I feel like Radio City was a bigger sound, and I didn't feel like it was unwieldy in any sense. I think maybe number one record has more has kind of catchier songs, but or more identifiable like pop songs type structure. But I thought Radio City, if we're gonna get into the review soon, Radio City I liked more than number one record actually.
Gotcha. I actually agree with you, Josh, and we'll get into the review in a little bit. You know what? Let me polish off the bio here, and then we'll just kind of go right into the review. So I haven't mentioned, by the way, the other two members of the band, and it's probably important that I at least mention bassist Andy Hummel, because he actually is a songwriter and singer on many of the tracks. Not many, some of the tracks. The primary singer-songwriters on the first album are Chilton and Bell, and then, of course, Bell leaves, and Chilton's still singing the majority of the songs on the second one, but Hummel kind of is jumping in and singing songs to balance it out or providing harmonies at different times. So I do want to mention both of those members of the band as well, but the vast majority of the writing is done by Chilton and Bell as a combination, and you can definitely tell the difference between their songs, in my opinion, on number one record, and then Chilton carries the heavier load on Radio City. Another part of Big Star's story that you just have to describe is they were not only not commercially successful in their day, they were bafflingly, quizzically unsuccessful. Right. To the point where their level of non-success, the only group I can think of, Josh, that has a similar story to this, or you know who I'm going to say, the Zombies. I think is another one where you listen to this and you're like, how in God's name did they not become popular? And of course they became a cult act later. But if you remember the Zombies, they broke up and then became famous, but basically had kind of given up and said, we moved on. And there's a little bit of that with Big Star as well. Bell struggled with depression. And after the first album, he and Chilton had creative tensions, and he left the band, never to return. It would have been interesting if he had survived, right, to see when the 80s and 90s indie rock came. I mean, my God, you just can absolutely imagine them playing, festivals and stuff because Alex Chilton and an updated Big Star did do that, right? But so he leaves, and then the band carries on, and then Radio City also bombs even more, actually, and that actually leads Chilton to become disillusioned. The story behind Third or Sister Lovers is fascinating. I'm actually going to save it for when we talk about that episode on Cold Listen Hot Take and build it in there, so I don't want to go too far ahead. But the thing to know about why they were not successful was they were on Stax Records, which was kind of an influence to them. They loved Motown and Stax Records stuff in the 60s. But Stax just really dropped the ball on promoting them. Even when they'd play concerts that were successful, people would go to buy the record. They just couldn't find it anywhere.
Oh, jeez. So they weren't even making them.
You got it. It was pretty much they were doomed to have no success. Jeez. Is kind of what ended up happening there. Stax. So they have Ardent Records they're on for a while, and then Stax is there. I want to say Columbia might have been the next. Every time they went to a new record company, I think it was Columbia did not prioritize the record. In fact, they de-emphasized it. So instead of Radio City making up for the mistakes of number one record, it actually just compounded it, and they just never were widely distributed and just were never able to get an audience because, it's pretty much described constantly just a series of record companies just dropped the ball on them. And it really is amazing because so many bands that sounded like them afterwards were not just successful, but wildly successful. And they sounded enough like wildly successful bands in the 60s, in fact, quite a bit like them, that
I would think so, yeah.
you would have thought the halo of sounding like those 60s bands, or the visionary stuff of what they were going to sound like leading the way, would have led to album sales, but unfortunately it just didn't do it. So in their prime, Big Star was basically just an unknown band that ended up becoming cult favorites later, and that is kind of Big Star's place in music history.
Shades of Nick Drake also, in terms of influence later on.
Yeah, all the way down to Chris Bell, struggled with depression, died young and stuff like. I mean, there's a lot of sort of wrote songs that were sad but profound and stuff like that. There's a lot of similarities with them, a lot of similarities with the Zombies, I thought too, like I mentioned before, in terms of as a band. So they're often also described as being similar to Badfinger, who we haven't covered as well, who's another band that sort of floated under the radar. So there you go. That is a little bit of Big Star's bio. Like I said, we'll continue it when we do Third and Sister Lovers. We've kind of talked around on the edges of how we feel about these albums. Josh, let's start with number one record, okay, their debut, and let's chop that one up a little bit. Thoughts on number one record?
So right from the jump, they have it kind of catches you with that jangle guitar, and it kind of has this laid back rock vibe that is not as I would say almost like folky or I don't know, that West Coast Birds sound that they had, but it's still like good vibes, but they're backed by like really good guitar and also harmonizing. They have at least two people harmonizing often on their songs. So that's kind of what I picked up from the Birds comparison. They often have the big guitars up front as well, which I noticed, and they just have the album and the band just seems to have this really good pop sensibility to them. They structure their songs like the Beatles. They're very short song structures overall. Songs are often like 2.5 to maybe 3.5 minutes long, I would say on average.
And all the way down to most of the songs being dubbed as from Bell and Chilton, like Lennon and McCartney, which was on purpose. Yep.
And I didn't notice, so I didn't pick up on kind of the differences because I didn't look at the bio either of the two songwriters, so you'll have to expand on that a little bit. But all the way through, it has this this tone and feel of just of like 60s pop music in a way. They aren't afraid to branch out and try different things. I'm thinking specifically of the India song, which almost has like this Renaissance fair start to it, but then it veers back into more traditional sounding song, and it is about India, and they mentioned gin and tonics as well.
That is the one song, by the way. So Chris Bell wrote one song by himself, My Life Is Right.
Yep.
The 8 of the songs were written by Bell and Chilton as a combination. Okay. And then Andy Hummel wrote the India song.
Okay.
So that is the one, and that's also the only song on the album he sings. Just for reference,
okay.
Josh,
yep.
It goes in order from 1 to 12. Bell, Chilton, Bell, Chilton, Bell. Then there's the Hummel song. Chilton, Bell, Chilton, Bell, Chilton, Bell, and Chilton. So they alternate songs with the exception of Hummel just coming on the India song. So every other song, if you just factor out the India song, starting with Bell at the top, and then them finishing with Bell and Chilton as the coda at 101. So that can give you an idea of what you're listening to.
So based on that, in my listen, I think I'm more of a Chilton fan. I think those songs are stronger, and those are ones I responded to more, especially the Ballad of El Goodo, 13.
They're both Chilton songs, yep.
Yeah. They also They have, they incorporate tambourine, which I appreciate. I feel like I haven't heard that in a while in our albums that we've talked about. It's right up front as well at times, especially in When My Baby Is Beside Me. And I think later on, not on this album, they put some harmonica in, and I think they use some horns too. So yeah, they are. That's kind of my initial thoughts. What about you? How'd you feel listening to number one record?
So this was a really interesting one because to me the two albums were the sound is because Bell and Chilton have a similar type of voice, but there's differences where I agree. I like the Chilton sung songs better in terms of just the flow and stuff like that. The first thing I mentioned earlier was that this album is much cleaner produced than Radio City, in my opinion. And that was not unintentional, by the way, when I looked it up. It appears that Chris Bell was sort of the studio guy. He was big on how the album sounded and spending time in it, where the others were sort of more, we'll go in and record it and, more songwriter, more play live type folks. But they said Bell was really into that. There was also a gentleman by the name of John Fry, who the band wanted to credit with production and things like that, and he sort of stepped back from taking credit on it, but he also had a hand in the production for this, and so that would kind of be the first thing that I'd see, that there definitely is a cleaner production on it. The second thing I would say, and this goes for both albums, is if you're not careful, your first thought is to say how much this sounds like music that you recognize from the 80s, 90s, and 00s, right? Because there's 1,000 different, God, some albums more than others. So there's ones that Radio City sounds more like, and ones that this one sounds more like. This is it's a lighter album, as Josh said. It's a little bit poppier. I think it's almost borderline twee-ish at times, like that term you describe. Radio City is definitely a little bit more of a hard driving album. It sounds more plugged in indie. There's definitely like a Matthew Sweet. So I guess this one's more Elliott Smith, where the second one's more Matthew Sweet, if you're trying to use a 90s analogy. I want to go away from that, though, because a remarkable thing about this album is everything that we're comparing it to is albums from the early to mid-90s. This album was released in 1972. And the thing that stood out is, holy cow, nobody sounded like this in 1972.
That's kind of remarkable. I mean, consider all the albums that we covered from the 72 period, and there's not really anything like this.
I mean, I was trying to figure, and we've talked in the past about other bands that seem like they were dropped into a time period outside of their time. And Velvet Underground, who we talked about before, who does not really sound like Big Star, but they have a similar vibe. We've said the Stooges, right? Eno, different stuff like that. But this is different. This is people doing something that you can recognize, like pop songwriting between 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and at the longest, 4 minutes, I think, but doing it in a way that portended the future, but the future that they portended didn't even come till way after they were there. So they were like 2 or 3 iterations ahead of the future, right? And I think that's their influence is so strong in that era. It's just fascinating. This band floated around in the ether and then resurfaced after a couple other musical styles came in, that were nothing like them in the mid to late 70s and then early 80s. And it was like, oh, we're going to pick this up all of a sudden with college indie rock in the 80s of REM and there's REM and later Teenage Fan Club. I definitely heard all over this, and just a lot of bands that are going to be all over the albums that we do in the 80s and 90s as well. So those are two sort of general things.
Before you go, so for comparison's sake, here are some other albums that we've discussed that came out in 72 also. Yeah. So we've got Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust by David Bowie, Exile on Main Street by The Stones, Pink Moon by Nick Drake, Close to the Edge by Yes, Harvest by Neil Young, Transformer by Lou Reed, Machine Head Deep Purple, Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull, and it just goes on and on. And none of those albums sound like this. I mean, the Lou Reed album and the Nick Drake album definitely contributed to some of what indie rock was doing later, but not so faithfully to a specific sound. Right. And they sound
like predecessors in their era that were picked up on and improved upon, or not even improved, just picked up upon and evolved on, right? Whereas this is like laying the foundation that people literally took and ran with later. The thing about this album is there are lush hooks on this album. It's almost Tom Petty-ish in that like it builds to this very quick chorus. You don't have to go around. There's cascading guitars that I love because there's guitars darting around doing different things. As Josh mentioned, both albums, but especially this one, have harmonies. Definitely the interplay between Bell and Chilton's voices is a huge sonic palette for it. But it's funny because I think I read one time that Chilton said that he and Bell didn't describe the harmonies as like, you sing at this and I'll be the third above, right? He was more just they would sing and then he would adjust to what Chilton was doing. And you can hear it kind of in this album because he's not always singing the harmony that you would think someone would sing. One high, one low is the obvious one, right? One singing the same thing, but one above or two above, something like that. He's more just doing off-kilter stuff, which really works for me a lot.
I feel like they do that in the music as well in Radio City. I feel like they're in minor chords or something at times.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to save a little bit of my comments for Radio City to there. It's hard to do two albums by the same group back to back, but big choruses, pop songs designed to be accessible. Not a lot of weak sister tracks either. There's not tracks that I would call. You know how some albums just have like bad tracks? Now, I like the more upbeat stuff more than I like the ballads, but I don't dislike the ballads either. And there's an even balance between the up-tempo stuff and the ballads. But this is guitar pop music, which, we're underserved on in the 70s. As much as the 70s has yielded fruit for us, the 60s was just filled with this type of guitar pop. The three bands we mentioned before, right? Early Who, Rolling Stones, Byrds, Beatles, Kinks. They're just shake. You shake a stick and they're all over the place. In the 70s, really the only people we've covered who've done this type of guitar pop. I mean, we did that Flaming Groovies album, right, which was sort of in the same element there. And outside of that, there's not a lot of like guitar pop. Like we've talked,
I mean, like glam is like T-Rex is kind of in that vein in terms of the poppiness, but not in the sound really, and not so much rooted in the sound of the 60s and evolving it like this is. And I think that's I at the end of the day, I think number one record, what you listen to on this album and what is profound about this album is the jangly guitars that are layered, that there isn't much that sounded like this outside of the Byrds that we've covered in albums so far. But there's a lot that sounds like this if you're someone who grew up listening to like 90s and 2000s alternative rock. And even if you're someone who's newer to the game, you have 50 years of pop rock music to cover. So this might not stand out as being so prescient as it is because you'll have heard it so often, but it really is, when you're listening to music chronologically from 1960s to now, it really does stand out for how ahead of its time it is. So that's one. The big hooks is the other thing. They really on this album build to strong choruses that lend themselves to re-listenability. So I really like this album a lot. I didn't like it quite as much as Radio City, and I'll expand on that later, but that's not to take away from this. This was a highly pleasant listen, really tight, really ahead of its time and revolutionary, and it's just a feel-good record, I'd say. Even though the lyrics sometimes can be a little bit, not depressing, but, talking about, challenges in life, right? It's there. I think we probably should mention that, the song that if you're going to know a song from this album, it's going to be In the Street, I'd say, right? Would that be the one? And definitely. I think the reason most people would know it, ironically enough, even though it wasn't sung by Big Star in it, is that it was the theme song for That 70s Show, if you've never seen that, which I don't know if I ever put two and two together on that because I wasn't as familiar with Big Star as I should be. I
but when
definitely
I heard
did not know that when hearing it.
But I guess the version on that 70s show was by Cheap Trick.
Okay.
Yeah. So speaking of guitar pop, my
Yeah.
God, there's a guitar pop
Power
band.
pop
So,
for sure.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's weird too, and we've spoken on this before, how there's sometimes like a fallow period where the band doesn't seem to impact the musical landscape, but then, like you said, like it almost like skips a decade, and then like all these bands from the 90s like have found this band and like are influenced by it.
Well, and Christ, REM and 10,000 Maniacs and any number of bands, that play that Rickenbacker guitar that we first heard with George Harrison and the Byrds, right? Like this is the evolution of that.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. So before we move to Radio City, Josh, any final thoughts do you have on this album, number one record specifically?
It was just it was a refreshing listen. I feel like we've been in the 70s for a while, and this is kind of like filled a gap or highlighted something that I forgot about from the 60s.
Yeah, I feel pretty safe, even though Matt is not on this review, in saying that Matt is going to be all over this album, because as much as Josh and I like good, solid, power pop punk, not punk, power pop, that is Matt's super wheelhouse. So I'm just going to go ahead and say he's going to love both of these albums, but I think number one record, it's a shame he's not here, because I kind of had the feeling Josh and I might lean more to Radio City because of what was different on that one, but I would say Matt would be the biggest defender on number one record. Now we'll check that, but
I will be interested to know too how much he knew of Big Star in his history of music listening.
Gotcha. Well, continuing our history of music listening, let's just go right in to Radio City, Josh. So do you want to describe a little bit about the differences in your mind between Radio City and number one record, or take it wherever you want, and I'll kind of jump in.
Yeah, so it sounded somehow harder than number one record. It sounded a bit more country in a way. I picked up on it. It almost I wrote down like this is like the best bar band ever in a way. I can just picture them playing in some sort of bar in the South, well, in Memphis, and the it just sounds. I know we keep coming back to this, but this album sounds even more like bands from the 90s and like the Gin Blossoms, and I picked up on some Shins.
That's
maybe.
Another band. Yep, that's Big Starish. Yep,
and then they're not afraid to. I don't know. You said that. Did you say Bell was not on this album?
Bell wrote a couple songs on this album, which I'll clean the stacks on as you're finishing. But he left the band. They became inactive for I think 4 months, and then they immediately started recording this album with new members. So that "Oh My Soul" and "Back of a Car." Chilton claims they were written by committee, but Bell was thought to have contributed a lot of the music and lyrics to it.
Okay.
Yep, and so that the band that recorded this album, so that we can update who's on this. It's a 3-piece band at this point. So now it is Chilton, Hummel, and Jody Stevens on drums, and he takes on the harmonizing vocals. Jody Stevens does. So there you go.
Yeah, so I think they, in some ways, they branch out more on this. They have some piano. They have some harmonica. I feel like the drums are up front more. I noticed the drums more on this album, which I appreciated. And even the bass, too, on something like She's a Mover, I noticed more. And, God, this album starts out so strong for me. Like, those top, like, 3 or 4 tracks were one after the other I was really impressed by. And they see, God, they're doing something where... And I haven't really been able to narrow down what it is, but they seem offbeat in a way, either in like where they place the chorus, or what range they sing the chorus in, or what chord I guess they sing the chorus in. They're doing something different in this, and I noticed it on Radio City more so than number one record. I think maybe, I know you said I didn't notice the production aspect, but I do feel like maybe they are trying to define their own sound more as opposed to being an homage to other 60s bands, if that makes sense. And yeah, this is another album that breezes by. We didn't mention the runtime on these, but they're basically both under 40 minutes, and they've got but they're not afraid to go to the pop songs too. I mean, I would say September Girls is probably the most recognizable song on this album.
Absolutely. I would say this. If we talked about the first album being influenced by the 60s groups with the big choruses, and I'd even say the first album has elements of things like Tom Petty and stuff where it's, a little bit more calmer, I guess would say. This is a more turbulent album. And it's even the lyrics on the first album didn't stand out to me nearly as much as the lyrics did here. The lyrics very much feel like one writer as opposed to two different writers on this one, and there's some truth to that because Chilton, it was a lot of the songs were written as a group, right? But you can see Chilton's influence more because there's he's a part of the writing team for every one, with the other guys chipping in here and there. So there's a through line on it, and I think that I had read that kind of it was influenced by him sort of being desperate to become famous. You know what I mean? After they did it, so it was like kind of the lyrics were his frustration and sort of like urgency of trying to become famous after the bust of the first album. So that's very interesting. I mentioned it before, but the thing I'd say here is it's very interesting what they do with their choruses, because the music still very much builds to a traditional chorus, right? Like it builds up, crescendos, and it's funny because the music will at times continue on what would be a traditional chord verse chorus, but a lot of times, and I don't know if you noticed this, Josh, they'll get into the chorus, but they'll only do what feels like a quarter or a half of the chorus, and then they'll abandon it.
Way Out West, they definitely
Way Out West is the perfect example for sure. The first time I heard Way Out West, I almost started singing what I was certain was going to be the chorus, and at the beginning they didn't continue it; they just stopped it, right?
Yeah,
and
it's
the
like
music
they fade
kept
out
going.
almost or something. It's weird.
Yeah, but then they did the thing where it's the first time around, there's nothing besides the first part of the chorus, and it stops. The second time they give you the first part, then there's a little bit of a pause, right, where the music keeps going, and then they bring it back to a part of the chorus, but once again, they don't finish that part of the chorus. And it's interesting because so many songs like that would just plow into a multi-layered chorus, but instead they just do a piece of the chorus and let it stand there with the guitars. As I said, cascading, that's a good description for it on this one, with the guitars still following the chorus without the words going with them. So it's a really interesting start-stop chorus that happens the second time. And they do that quite a bit, that their choruses are not intuitive. Now, a lot of times that would frustrate me, I think, because so many of the bands that that were influenced by Big Star just always followed the chorus, right? REM, you mentioned the Gin Blossoms, right? They were hitting just these bands that they were big, and I said Tom Petty, right? Another guy who finished the chorus all the time. These people that were there. This is where they're similar to the Byrds, though, and they're more plugged in the Byrds, but the Byrds used to do that too. My Back Pages and stuff, they would kind of leave a chorus that felt like an incomplete chorus, but it always worked because of the structure of the songwriting. And that's what I liked about this. It was a more aggressive album. It kept me on my toes a little bit more. As Josh mentioned, it starts on fire. I think where I would say, though, is it never really lets off the gas, right? It's still, it stays strong the entire way through. There's songs as deep in the album as September Girls at 10, and even, Daisy Glaze is at 8, which is a really strong song. And then the first side of the album, which would have been literally the first side of the album, from Oh My Soul to You Get What You Deserve, is just one big pop song after another. It sounds like 5 straight singles.
Yep.
But the back end kind of goes into a variety of lyrical topics, which interest me. And it just, I really, really enjoyed this album a lot. It's going to end up very high on my list of albums from the 70s.
Yep.
It seems like a more vibrant band to me in some ways, and they were vibrant on both albums, but this is a band that has a little bit more edge than the first album, which was a little polished and a little bit naive. This one is a little bit more world weary and a little bit more edgy. You can hear a little bit of frustration. Any of the saccharine or the sweet is gone.
Desperation, maybe, because
Well, and you hear it. And that's why when I read about it, I'm like, I get it, because I can hear it in this. It sounds, I mentioned before, unwieldy. It doesn't sound unwieldy in the sense that they are a quintessential tight pop band, right? So it's not unwieldy that way. It's more unwieldy in towards of the emotion that's hiding under the surface, simmering under the surface a little bit. So I really enjoyed this album.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. It was definitely up there in terms of my albums for the decade and discoveries also.
Yeah, and knowing what it led to, which was pretty much this was the last hurrah. Like we said, they released the third album in 1978, so a pretty big gap, and they released it when they were not a band anymore. It was basically cold from material that was hanging around when Big Star started to get a little bit of a cult following in the late 70s. And you would have thought that when that happened, right, that the band would have capitalized on it, but it did not happen. I almost feel like other bands took what Big Star did and ran with it, and not like in a predatory way, right? More just for whatever reason, other bands just had the
marketing
wherewithal, the marketing, the learned experience, resilience. Pick whatever word you want to kind of take the blueprint and run with it. And I don't want to keep referencing bands, but to me, maybe the band that Big Star should have been was probably REM in some ways. And, it's interesting because the 80s, the Replacements who wrote, Alex Chilton kind of relived the experience, right?
I know, yeah.
Of being weird. A band that when you listen to their albums now, you're like, how the hell could this band not have been pop? Now, they had more demons, right, with substance abuse and stuff like that. And, Big Star, from what it seems like, were as much doomed by, incompetence of their record label. And, although there was depression with Bell, right, that led him to leave. But, yeah, it's very interesting, the tropes that they're there. The great underappreciated artists. And, I didn't even mention, by the way, other bands, like some of the British bands in the 80s, like the Smiths, right, who the Jangle, I mean, Johnny Marr, is absolutely, a guy that you could see listening to this album, mixing it with a little bit of like the late 70s British influence as well, right? And there you go. There's the Smith. And while Morrissey's cribbing the Velvet Underground, and then they fuse all of these great cult bands together, right? So
Yep. I will add there is a documentary about them called Big Star, Nothing Can Hurt Me from 2012. Now, I have not seen it yet, but it seems like if any listeners or us are interested, it is available to rent digitally and check it out.
I think I'm going to check that out this weekend. I've got a long weekend, and these two albums intrigued me enough to definitely go seek it out. So
nice.
Yep. Strong recommend for me on both albums,
Same.
Especially Radio City. It will be high on my list of albums in the 70s, even though we're only about halfway done. I'm very confident saying that.
Nice.